For decades, Johnny Carson sat across from some of Hollywood's most dazzling leading men. They arrived with perfect smiles, polished manners, and stories carefully designed for millions of viewers. But behind the glamorous image, the source material tells a very different story, one involving hidden relationships, manufactured romances, studio pressure, and carefully protected secrets. Some of these men were trapped by the era they lived in. Others allegedly helped construct the illusion themselves. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to separate Hollywood's dream from the truth behind it. And the first name on the list was actor number 1, Rock Hudson. Few men represented Hollywood masculinity more completely than Rock Hudson. Towering, handsome, effortlessly charming, and blessed with the kind of screen presence studios could build an empire around, Hudson became the ultimate romantic leading man. Whenever he appeared on The Tonight Show, the image was already established. The confident bachelor, the irresistible movie star, the man millions of women were supposed to dream about. But according to the account presented in the source transcript, that image required an enormous amount of management behind the scenes. Hudson's private life was carefully separated from the persona audiences were buying. His relationships with women were often presented publicly as evidence of his heterosexual image, while people around him allegedly helped arrange appearances that would reinforce it. The most famous example was his 1955 marriage to Phyllis Gates, who worked as his secretary and had connections to his management circle. The marriage became part of the public story surrounding Hollywood's most eligible bachelor. Yet the transcript portrays it as something much more complicated, a relationship shaped by pressure surrounding Hudson's sexuality and by fears that exposure could destroy his career. That contradiction followed him onto television. Carson could joke with Hudson about romance and beautiful actresses, while the audience saw exactly what Hollywood wanted them to see. Behind that polished performance, however, Hudson was living a private life that the public knew almost nothing about. Then came the devastating revelation of the 1980s. Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS and became one of the most famous faces associated with the epidemic. His final public appearances transformed the way audiences remembered the enormous star they had once seen as almost invincible. His story remains tragic precisely because the deception cannot be separated from the era that demanded it. Hudson was both a beneficiary of Hollywood's image machine and ultimately one of its most famous casualties. And if Rock Hudson showed how completely a studio could protect a manufactured image, the next man took the idea of a hidden life to an entirely different level. Actor number 2, Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr seemed almost impossible to distrust. As Perry Mason, he projected intelligence, authority, and absolute control. When he sat across from Johnny Carson, audiences were seeing a dignified television institution, a serious man with an apparently heartbreaking personal history. The story surrounding that history, however, became far more complicated after Burr's death. The source transcript describes a biography that presented Burr as a grieving widower who had supposedly lost a wife named Annette Sutherland and a son named Michael Evan. Those tragedies became part of the explanation for why the enormously successful actor remained unmarried. But the transcript also describes Burr's long-term relationship with Robert Benavides, whom Burr met during his work on Perry Mason. According to accounts of their relationship, the two men remained together for decades. That created an extraordinary contrast between Burr's private world and the public biography attached to him. On television, the story of the lonely widower provided an explanation audiences could easily accept. It also discouraged uncomfortable questions. Why wasn't a man as successful as Raymond Burr married? Why did he live such a private existence? The tragedy surrounding his supposed family answered those questions before anyone could ask them. The source goes further, portraying some elements of Burr's family history as fabricated or heavily embellished. Whether every detail of that account can be established is another matter, but the central contradiction is what makes the story so compelling. A famous actor whose public image suggested loneliness, while his private life reportedly contained a decades-long partnership. Robert Benavides eventually became more visible after Burr's death in 1993, helping bring their relationship into public discussion. For Johnny Carson, that would have been an especially striking revelation. Carson had spent years interviewing Burr as the dignified television star audiences believed they knew. But the next story was different. It wasn't built around a quiet, respectable image. It was wrapped in diamonds, feathers, piano music, and one of the most flamboyant personalities television had ever seen. Actor number 3, Liberace. When Liberace walked onto The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson knew exactly what the audience was going to get. There were sparkling clothes, extravagant jewelry, theatrical gestures, jokes, stories about luxury, and that unmistakable personality that turned an ordinary television appearance into an event. Carson generally played along, allowing Liberace to perform rather than treating his flamboyance as something to ridicule. To millions of viewers, Liberace was simply the world's most extravagant entertainer. But behind the spectacle was a private relationship that later became the center of a major legal battle. The source focuses heavily on Scott Thorson, a young man who became Liberace's companion. In Thorson's memoir Behind the Candelabra, he described a relationship in which Liberace exercised extraordinary control over his appearance and lifestyle. One of the most disturbing claims involved cosmetic surgery. According to Thorson's account, Liberace wanted his young companion's appearance altered so that he would resemble Liberace himself. The story became symbolic of what Thorson said was a relationship in which identity, appearance, money, and affection were all intertwined. The transcript also describes allegations of controlled clothing, dieting, drug use, emotional manipulation, and threats of financial abandonment. These are serious claims from Thorson's account, not details that should simply be treated as independently proven facts. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1982, Thorson filed a palimony lawsuit against Liberace. Liberace publicly denied that the two had been lovers and characterized Thorson as a disgruntled former associate. The legal battle exposed a private relationship that had been kept far away from the glamorous television persona. Liberace died in 1987. The official circumstances surrounding his death became another part of the controversy surrounding the image he had protected throughout his career. And that is what made Liberace such a fascinating figure in Carson's television world. The audience saw the costume, the piano, the laughter, and the glitter. But the next name reveals something even more painful. A young star who wasn't necessarily controlling the illusion, he was trapped inside it. Actor number 4, Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter looked like Hollywood had designed him specifically for the American dream. Golden hair, blue eyes, athletic build, a clean-cut smile. He was presented as the perfect young bachelor, the kind of movie star teenage girls could put on bedroom walls and mothers could proudly approve of. When Hunter appeared with Johnny Carson, that image came naturally. Carson could ask about romance, girlfriends, and Hollywood dating, while Hunter played the role everyone expected. But the source transcript argues that the real story was far less glamorous. Hunter worked during an era when studios had enormous control over the private lives of their stars. His manager Henry Wilson was known for representing young male actors, and Hollywood publicity routinely used carefully staged romances to reinforce heterosexual images. One example involved Natalie Wood. The two could be photographed together, looking like the perfect Hollywood couple. But the transcript portrays these appearances as publicity assignments rather than genuine romantic dates. That distinction mattered because Hunter was reportedly living under constant fear of exposure. The era's gossip magazines could threaten careers simply by publishing allegations about an actor's sexuality. Hunter later acknowledged his relationships with men, including his involvement with Anthony Perkins. The irony was painful. Two major male stars could care deeply for one another, yet the culture surrounding them made even ordinary affection dangerous. Hunter's public image, therefore, became a kind of performance. He could smile for photographers, appear beside actresses, and answer questions about romance, while privately dealing with a reality that could not safely be discussed. The source also references a 1955 police raid at a party involving Hunter and the subsequent pressure surrounding the incident. The details of the broader Hollywood cover-up have been debated, but the episode reflects the atmosphere of fear surrounding gay actors during the period. Hunter eventually outlived the system that had controlled his image and became far more open about his past. His story wasn't simply about deception. It was about what happened when an entertainment industry valued a marketable fantasy more than the private freedom of the person selling it. And the next man makes that conflict even more complicated because his public image was built around being a devoted husband and family man. Actor number 5, Anthony Perkins. The moment Anthony Perkins appeared on television, Johnny Carson had an obvious joke waiting. America knew Perkins as Norman Bates from Psycho, one of cinema's most unsettling characters. Yet the man sitting beside Carson seemed almost the opposite: shy, intellectual, awkward, and uncomfortable with the spotlight. That contrast made Perkins an irresistible guest. He could laugh about his frightening screen image and then talk about domestic life, family, and marriage. To viewers, It created the comforting picture of an actor who had escaped the darkness of Norman Bates and found ordinary happiness. But Perkins' private life was far more complicated. Accounts of his life describe relationships with men before his marriage, including his involvement with Tab Hunter and dancer Grover Dale. At a time when homosexuality could destroy a Hollywood career, Perkins reportedly struggled intensely with the expectations placed upon him. In 1973, at the age of 41, he married photographer Barry Berenson. Together they had children, and the family became part of Perkins' public identity. The source interprets that marriage as an attempt to construct a conventional life under enormous social pressure. But it is important to distinguish interpretation from established fact. Perkins' own feelings were complex, and his marriage cannot simply be reduced to a publicity stunt. What is undeniable is that Perkins lived during a period when many gay actors felt compelled to conceal important parts of themselves. His public appearances therefore carried an unusual tension. When Carson asked about marriage and family, Perkins could speak sincerely about the people he loved, while still withholding parts of his personal history. In 1992, Perkins died from AIDS-related complications. Public discussion of his illness was initially cautious, reflecting the stigma that still surrounded AIDS at the time. His story is ultimately less about a villain creating a fake life, and more about a performer caught between private identity, public expectations, and a Hollywood system that offered very little room for honesty. But there was another legendary Hollywood man whose image was even more deeply tied to traditional masculinity, and whose private life became one of the industry's most persistent mysteries. Actor number 6 Randolph Scott. Randolph Scott didn't need a complicated character. He had the hat, the horse, the quiet voice, and the rugged face of the classic Western hero. On screen, he represented an ideal of American manhood, independent, disciplined, tough, and almost completely self-contained. But one part of that image created an enduring Hollywood mystery. For years, Scott and Cary Grant were closely associated in public accounts because of the period they spent living together. The source transcript presents their relationship as a long-term romantic partnership, although the nature of their relationship has been disputed by historians and biographers. What is much less controversial is that the two men shared a home in Santa Monica during Hollywood's golden years and were frequently photographed together. Those photographs became fascinating precisely because they were so ordinary. The two appeared at home, around the pool, and enjoying domestic life together. To modern viewers, those images can look remarkably intimate. At the time, however, the public explanation was generally framed around friendship and shared expenses. Hollywood had powerful reasons to protect the masculine images of both men. Scott was a major Western star, while Grant was one of the most recognizable leading men in American cinema. Neither man's career could easily accommodate public speculation about homosexuality during that era. Both eventually married women, but the rumors surrounding Scott and Grant never entirely disappeared. Johnny Carson operated in a later generation, when the old Hollywood system was beginning to weaken, yet the mythology surrounding stars like Scott remained powerful. When Carson spoke with older Hollywood personalities, he was often dealing with images that had been carefully constructed decades earlier. Scott eventually retired from acting and withdrew from the public spotlight. His story, therefore, remains less about a proven secret than about the extraordinary gap between Hollywood's official version of masculinity and the private questions that surrounded it. And finally, we come to a man whose romantic image became almost inseparable from television itself, a star who played idealized characters while privately struggling with a very different reality. Actor number 7 Richard Chamberlain. Richard Chamberlain arrived in Hollywood with almost everything a studio could want. Handsome, refined, talented, and naturally suited to romantic roles, he became one of television's most recognizable leading men. His success in productions such as Dr. Kildare, Shogun, and The Thorn Birds made him especially popular with female audiences. On The Tonight Show, that image followed him. He could sit beside Johnny Carson, answer questions about women and romance, and maintain the polished reserve that made him such an effective romantic hero. But Chamberlain was carrying a secret that he would not publicly acknowledge for decades. He was gay. The pressure surrounding that fact was enormous. During the height of his career, an openly gay leading man risked losing major opportunities, endorsements, and the carefully maintained romantic fantasy built around him. The source transcript describes Chamberlain's long-term relationship with Martin Rabbit and emphasizes how difficult it was for the couple to navigate legal and social restrictions. It also makes the dramatic claim that Chamberlain adopted Rabbit as his son as a way of protecting their relationship and property. That detail should be treated cautiously, because the circumstances and legal meanings surrounding their relationship have often been simplified in retellings. What is firmly established is that Chamberlain remained publicly closeted during the height of his fame. He continued playing romantic heroes while privately living a life the audience was not allowed to see. That changed much later. In 2003, Chamberlain publicly discussed his sexuality in his memoir Shattered Love. By then, he was 69 years old, his career had already passed its peak, and the Hollywood environment was dramatically different from the one in which he had become famous. The timing says almost everything. Chamberlain had spent decades protecting the image that had made him successful. Only when the consequences of honesty were far less threatening did he finally speak openly. And that makes his story an especially fitting conclusion to this list, not because he was necessarily the greatest liar, but because his career demonstrates how powerful the fear behind Hollywood's secrets could become. Actor number 8, Cary Grant. There was a reason Cary Grant seemed almost too perfect to be real. He had the voice, the clothes, the timing, the confidence, and that effortless smile that made even the most complicated situation look easy. On screen, he could walk into a room and immediately become most interesting man in it. He was the sophisticated gentleman, the romantic hero, the witty bachelor, and eventually one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood history. But the more carefully you look at Cary Grant's life, the more fascinating the picture becomes. Because behind that perfectly controlled public image was a man whose private life generated questions for decades. And one of the most persistent stories involved another major Hollywood star, Randolph Scott. Grant and Scott met during Hollywood's golden age, when both men were working under the powerful studio system. Their friendship quickly became more than an ordinary Hollywood acquaintance. The two lived together for extended periods and share homes in California, including the famous property that became associated with the name Bachelor Hall. And Hollywood noticed. That was the dangerous part. During the 1930s, the studio system didn't simply sell movies. It sold personalities. A leading man wasn't allowed to be merely an actor. He had to become a fantasy. Cary Grant was marketed as the sophisticated romantic bachelor, while Randolph Scott was presented as the rugged masculine hero. So when two highly successful male stars lived together, the arrangement naturally attracted curiosity. Hollywood's solution was publicity. Photographs appeared showing Grant and Scott relaxing together, enjoying domestic life, and presenting themselves as glamorous bachelors. Some of those images were clearly connected to publicity campaigns, which makes them especially interesting today. What looks like spontaneous evidence of private life may actually have been part of the entertainment industry's carefully constructed machinery. But then came the rumors. For decades, writers, journalists, biographers, and Hollywood insiders speculated about the true nature of Grant and Scott's relationship. Some later accounts suggested that the relationship may have been romantic. Other people close to Grant rejected that interpretation entirely. That disagreement is important, because the historical record does not give us a simple answer that can honestly be presented as absolute fact. What we do know is that Grant's relationship with Scott became one of Hollywood's enduring mysteries, and the fact that the mystery survived for generations says something about the world in which these men lived. Imagine being Cary Grant. Your entire career depends on appearing desirable to women. Studios build stories around your bachelor status. Newspapers discuss your romances. Audiences are encouraged to imagine themselves as your future partner. Yet your real private life belongs to you. That tension followed Grant throughout his career. He eventually married several times, including marriages to Virginia Cherrill, Betsy Drake, and Diane Cannon. He became one of the most respected stars of his generation and continued appearing in films that defined sophisticated Hollywood entertainment. But marriage did not erase the questions surrounding him. In fact, it sometimes made the mystery even more complicated. Because Hollywood had a powerful formula. If a male star married a beautiful woman, the public image appeared complete. The audience didn't need to ask what existed outside the picture. And Cary Grant understood images better than almost anyone. He had spent his entire career transforming himself. Born Archibald Leach in Bristol, England, he eventually reinvented himself as Cary Grant, one of the most polished personalities in American cinema. The transformation was extraordinary. The awkward young man from England disappeared behind the elegant American movie star. But perhaps that is why Grant remains so fascinating. He wasn't simply an actor playing characters. He had become a character himself. The Cary Grant persona was so convincing that audiences sometimes forgot there was a private man behind it. Johnny Carson later inherited a television version of that same Hollywood mythology. When older movie stars appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences expected charm, romance, stories, and carefully polished memories. Carson could joke with them, tease them, and ask about their careers, but there were certain subjects that remained largely protected by the conventions of the era. Cary Grant's story belongs inside that world. It isn't a simple story about whether one rumor was true or false. It's a story about privacy, celebrity, masculinity, publicity, and the enormous pressure placed on Hollywood stars to remain inside the identity that made them valuable. And perhaps the most revealing detail is this. Cary Grant spent his entire professional life making audiences believe that everything about him was effortless. The clothes looked effortless. The confidence looked effortless. The romance looked effortless. Even the mystery looked effortless. But behind that perfect smile was a man who understood that Hollywood was never simply about who you really were. It was about who millions of people believed you were. And if Cary Grant's story shows us how carefully Hollywood could protect a star's image, the next name reveals something even more complicated. A performer who didn't just challenge Hollywood's definition of masculinity, but changed what a leading man could look like forever. Actor number 9 Montgomery Clift. Hollywood had spent decades teaching audiences what a leading man was supposed to look like. He was confident. He was handsome. He was physically powerful. He knew how to flirt with the camera and make women fall in love with him. Then Montgomery Clift arrived and quietly broke the formula. Clift didn't need to dominate a room. He could stand still and make the audience lean forward. His performances were vulnerable, intense, intelligent, and emotionally unpredictable. Instead of playing the perfect man, he often played men who were wounded, confused, lonely, or fighting against themselves. That made him revolutionary. It also made him difficult for Hollywood to control. Clift became one of the most important actors of his generation through films such as Red River, The Search, A Place in the Sun, and From Here to Eternity. He was nominated for Academy Awards and quickly established himself as a performer whose talent was almost impossible to imitate. But behind the celebrated performances was an intensely private man. And one of the most important people in his life was Elizabeth Taylor. When Clift and Taylor appeared together in A Place in the Sun in 1951, the chemistry between them was extraordinary. Hollywood immediately understood what it had on its hands. They looked beautiful together. They were young. They were talented. And audiences could easily believe they were watching a genuine romantic connection. The studio's publicity machine encouraged that fantasy. But the relationship between Clift and Taylor was much more complicated than the romance audiences saw on screen. They became extremely close friends, and Taylor was one of the few people who seemed capable of seeing past Clift's public image. Their bond continued long after their first film together, and Taylor remained one of the people most fiercely protective of him. That loyalty became especially important later. Clift was intensely private about his sexuality during a period when Hollywood offered very little protection to actors who did not fit the expected image of a leading man. Later biographies and accounts have described relationships between Clift and men, while his personal life also included relationships with women. That complexity matters, because Hollywood wanted simple stories. The industry wanted the handsome actor to be the romantic hero. The newspapers wanted the beautiful couple. The studios wanted a star whose private life wouldn't interfere with ticket sales. Clift didn't fit comfortably inside any of those boxes. He wanted his work to speak for itself. And then, in 1956, everything changed. While filming Raintree County, Clift attended a party at Elizabeth Taylor's home. Later that night, while driving away, he crashed his car into a telephone pole. The accident was catastrophic. Clift suffered devastating facial injuries and required extensive surgery. Elizabeth Taylor was reportedly among the first people to reach him and helped save his life when he was choking. But surviving the accident did not mean returning to normal. The physical damage changed his appearance. The psychological damage was even harder to escape. For an actor whose face had become part of his identity, reconstructive surgery created a painful new reality. The young Montgomery Clift audiences had known was suddenly gone. Hollywood did what Hollywood often did. It looked at the damaged star and began calculating what could still be sold. Clift continued working, however. That is one of the most important parts of his story. He didn't simply disappear. He returned to acting and continued giving powerful performances, even while struggling with pain and increasing dependence on alcohol and medication. His later career became increasingly difficult, but the performances themselves remained evidence of his extraordinary talent. And throughout all of this, Elizabeth Taylor remained in his corner. Their friendship survived professional pressure, physical transformation, addiction, and the judgment of the Hollywood machine. They worked together again in Raintree County, and later in Suddenly, Last Summer. For Taylor, Clift wasn't simply a damaged movie star. He was Montgomery. That distinction mattered, because by then, Hollywood had begun turning him into a tragedy. The press focused on his appearance. The gossip columns focused on his private life. The industry focused on whether he could still make money. But the people who knew him remembered something different, a deeply intelligent, emotionally sensitive actor who had changed American cinema. Clift died in 1966 at the age of 45. His death ended one of the most painful chapters in Hollywood's history, but it did not end the questions surrounding his private life. Years later, Elizabeth Taylor spoke openly about Clift's sexuality, helping bring greater attention to the private struggles he had been forced to conceal during his lifetime. And suddenly, audiences could look back at his career differently. The shy expression, the vulnerability, the emotional intensity, the refusal to become a conventional Hollywood hero. These weren't weaknesses. They were part of what made Montgomery Clift extraordinary. His story also exposes something darker about the old studio system. Hollywood wanted actors who could be packaged. Clift wanted to be an actor. Those two things were never completely compatible. He refused to become the stereotypical leading man, yet audiences loved him precisely because he felt real. And that may be the greatest irony of his life. The industry spent years trying to turn Montgomery Clift into an image. But his greatest performances came from parts of himself that could not be packaged. Johnny Carson's television era inherited many of the stars who had survived that system. Carson could interview them, laugh with them, and bring their stories into American living rooms. But Montgomery Clift belonged to an earlier Hollywood where some secrets were protected so aggressively that they could follow a person for an entire lifetime. His legacy, therefore, isn't simply tragedy. It is transformation. He helped prove that a leading man didn't have to be invincible. He didn't have to be loud. He didn't have to pretend that pain didn't exist. He could be vulnerable and still command the screen. And that is why Montgomery Clift remains one of the most haunting figures of Golden Age Hollywood. Not because he successfully hid a secret, but because the world around him demanded that so much of his real identity remain hidden in the first place.